All right, let's get right into it. We're diving into a financial puzzle today that honestly impacts every single one of us. In this explainer, even if you never ever look at the stock market, we are talking about the staggering, almost unbelievable scale of global debt. Have you ever wondered how the world economy actually functions behind the curtain? Well, we're going to break down the mechanics of national borrowing, who owes what, and most importantly, who is actually funding the entire planet.
To really grasp the scale of this mystery, we've got to look at the total bill first. And brace yourselves. The combined debt of all the countries in the world right now is $348 trillion. That is the number 348 followed by 12 zeros. It's an absolutely incomprehensible amount of money. If you try to picture it, your brain almost short circuits. It sounds like made-up monopoly money, but no, this is very real debt held by actual real-world nations.
Okay, let's dive into this because that massive number brings up an immediate, glaring contradiction. Think about it. If practically every single nation on Earth owes money, where is all this cash actually coming from? Is there some secret club of trillionaires just handing out loans to governments? To figure out this mystery, we first need to see exactly who's holding the heaviest bags.
Now, you might assume it's struggling nations carrying the most burden, but actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. The countries with the biggest debts are literally the most powerful economies on the planet. The United States holds a colossal $38 trillion in debt. China, the world's second largest economy, is sitting at $18 trillion, and India holds over $3.36 trillion. So the big question is, why do these absolute financial heavyweights need to borrow so much in the first place?
Well, it boils down to some pretty basic mechanics. Just like you or me, a government has money coming in and money going out. Their income is mostly the tax dollars paid by citizens and businesses, right? And they use that money for the essentials, building roads, running schools, constructing hospitals, and funding welfare programs. But more often than not, the cost of running and upgrading a whole country is way higher than what they're pulling in from taxes. That shortfall, that is what we call a budget deficit.
So, when a government hits a budget deficit, they really only have three plays to make. Option 1, they could just raise taxes, but let's be real, that creates massive public backlash. Nobody likes seeing their taxes go up. Option 2, cut spending. But if you do that, you're halting road construction, freezing school budgets, and basically slamming the brakes on overall development, which just frustrates the public and stalls the economy. So that leaves option 3 as the most practical path forward. You just borrow the money.
But it's not like a government can just stroll into a local bank and ask for a $1 trillion loan. Instead, they issue what are known as government bonds. You can think of a bond as a really formal promissory note. The government basically says, hey, give us this cash, and we promise to pay you back on this exact date, plus a specific amount of interest every single year. And because an actual government is making that promise, it's pretty much considered the safest investment out there. I mean, your money is guaranteed by an entire nation.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the plot twist. Who's actually buying all these bonds? Lenders aren't just faceless global mega institutions. It's us, the citizens. When you park money in a savings account or pay your insurance premium, put cash into your retirement pension, or invest in a mutual fund, those institutions take all our pooled money and they go buy government bonds.
Just to give you a really clear picture of how localized this can be, let's look at India. Over there, a staggering 90 to 95% of the national debt is domestic debt. That means the Indian government owes the vast majority of its debt right back to its own people, local banks, and domestic institutions. Just a tiny fraction is held by foreign investors. So when a country borrows, they're usually just borrowing from their own citizens.
So that kind of flips the script, doesn't it? If a country is up to its eyeballs in debt, does that mean it's on the verge of going bankrupt? Is all this debt inherently a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. When a government borrows from the public and pours that cash into development, it's circulating money right back into the economy. That creates jobs, it boosts businesses, and eventually that brings more tax revenue back to the government. It's a continuous, productive loop. Honestly, without that borrowing, the whole economic engine would just stall out.
That being said, just like any household, a country can't just borrow infinitely. There is a safe limit, and to figure out what that limit is, we use a metric called GDP, Gross Domestic Product. Think of it like a small village. If the farmers make 50 grand, the shops bring in 30 grand, and the doctors and teachers make 20 grand, that village's total income, its GDP, is $100,000 for the year. Zoom out to a whole country, and GDP is just the total value of all the rice, cars, software, and services they produce in a single year.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we measure the danger zone. It's the debt to GDP ratio. It directly compares a country's total debt to its total economic output. Take a look. Japan's ratio is sky high at 230%. The US is sitting at 120%, and India is much lower at 56%. The key takeaway here is that massive powerhouse economies like Japan and the US can safely handle way higher debt ratios, mostly because investors completely trust their ability to generate immense wealth and, actually repay their obligations.
Okay, but you're probably wondering, how does a country like the US actually pay off $38 trillion? Well, they kind of don't. The secret is a process called debt rollover. Governments rarely pay off massive national debts in one big chunk. Let's say they issued bonds back in 2015 to borrow $100 million for 10 years. When 2025 hits, they just issue brand new bonds to borrow another $100 million, and they use that new cash to pay off the folks who bought the old bonds. As long as the government keeps making those regular interest payments, the debt just smoothly rolls over to the next generation of investors.
But, and this is a big but, this delicate balancing act carries extreme risks. If an economy starts to wobble, inflation spikes out of control, and a government literally can't afford to pay the interest anymore, that rollover cycle violently snaps. And this isn't just some economic theory. We saw this exact nightmare scenario during the devastating 2022 economic crisis in Sri Lanka. When a country defaults and can't service its debt, new investors absolutely refuse to buy their bonds, the money supply vanishes, and the national economy just rapidly collapses.
So let's zoom back out to the global stage for a second, because the math gets pretty terrifying. Remember our total global debt of $348 trillion? Well, if you add up the total global GDP, literally the combined income of the entire planet, it's only about $114 trillion. Let that sink in for a second. Global debt is 3 times larger than the entire world's economic output. To make matters worse, the average interest rate on this debt is between 5 and 7%, while global GDP is only growing at about 3% a year. The debt is literally, mathematically outpacing the world's ability to earn.
Which logically leads people to ask the classic question about national economics, right? If a government prints its own currency and they have way too much debt, why not just turn on the money machines and print enough cash to pay everybody off? On paper, it sounds like a totally simple, victimless fix, doesn't it?
So the crucial point is, printing unbacked money is essentially financial poison. If a government just prints trillions of dollars out of thin air and dumps it into the economy to pay off debts, you're massively increasing the money supply without any actual increase in goods or services, and that triggers hyperinflation. The currency instantly loses its purchasing power, and prices for everyday stuff just absolutely skyrocket to impossible levels. We've seen this tragic reality play out in countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where a single loaf of bread ended up costing billions, and paper money became so completely worthless that people literally threw stacks of cash into the streets.
Let's move to and see how this builds when things really hit the fan. When a nation is teetering on the edge of that kind of collapse and normal investors are running for the hills, 2 major global safety nets step in: the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Now, they have very distinct roles. The World Bank is all about long-term development for poor and middle-income countries. Think funding for highways, water supply, and rural education. They offer super low interest rates and give countries 10 to 20 years to pay it back. The IMF, on the other hand, acts like an emergency room. They step in during acute, immediate financial crises, handing out short-term loans over 3 to 10 years just to stop a total economic flatline. But getting an emergency cash injection from the IMF is definitely not a pain-free process. Because they're stepping into a completely chaotic situation, their bailouts come attached to incredibly strict, harsh conditions. To make sure the struggling country actually gets its economy back under control and can repay the loan, the IMF basically forces the government to take some bitter medicine. We're talking drastically slashing government spending, hiking up taxes, pulling popular subsidies, and privatizing state-owned companies. It's essentially forced financial discipline.
But you might be wondering, where do the World Bank and the IMF actually get their money? Well, from the member countries who contribute funds. And this is exactly where global politics smashes right into global finance. Your financial contribution buys your voting power. The more cash a country puts in, the more control they get over global financial decisions. The United States holds the biggest chunk of voting power at roughly 16%, followed by Japan at around 6%, and India somewhere between 2.6 and 2.9%. In this system, money quite literally dictates who sets the rules for the rest of the world.
And that brings us to our final, kind of mind-blowing realization. The roads we're driving on, the schools we go to, these sprawling national budgets, and that mind-numbing $348 trillion of debt spinning around the globe. Absolutely none of it is backed by gold sitting in some vault. It is backed by pieces of paper, promissory notes, and governments continually rolling over their IOUs. When you really zoom out, this entire massive system is held together by nothing more than faith. Just total trust that tomorrow a country is still going to honor the promise it made today. So what do you think happens if that trust ever universally breaks? Something to chew on. Thanks for exploring this with me on today's Explainer, and keep questioning how our world works.